podcasts on reimagining Black boys. It involves a series of presentations that describe and explain the emotional and behavioral development of Black boys and youth. In this introductory segment, I will describe my background, my early experiences as a psychologist, and the failure that I experienced that led me onto a lifelong pursuit to discover why a disproportionate number of Black boys and youth suffer emotional pain and misbehave. This series describes what I learned along the way to answering that question, and it shares my thoughts about what we can do to improve the conditions of Black boys, to reduce problems, and to help smooth their path towards adulthood. In part one of this series, I describe my initial efforts to discover the earliest signs of difficulty that might predict later behavior problems that become so troubling at school and in the community. I was surprised to learn that Black boys' early development is rather typical and unremarkable, as you will see.
Deals. I'm delighted and honored to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Oscar Barberin. Dr. Barberin earned his PhD at Rutgers University and served on the faculty here at University of Michigan for, I think, like 20 years or so. Yeah. Um, and he's now a professor of psychology and African American studies at the University of Maryland. Dr. Barberin has led a number of important projects, including some major longitudinal studies of socioeconomic and academic development in children in the United States. He's also done that in South Africa and Uganda. Um, he's partnered with the Head Start program in Detroit to design and implement a program of universal preventative screening of psychological and social risks. And really, his groundbreaking research has profoundly influenced our understanding of the importance of family and community support and culturally responsive education in fostering resilience and success in Black boys. So today, I'm eager to see how Dr. Barberin's remarks will challenge us to confront systemic inequities and inspire us to create environments where every child can thrive no matter what their background is. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Oscar Barberin.
Thank you very much for this warm welcome in such a cold day. I really appreciate those of you who made it through the weather. I come from Florida, and so I was unable to bring some warm weather with me. But in the meantime, I hope that the ideas that we share will warm you and provide some insight. One of the first questions I get when I talk on the subject of Black boys is, how did you become interested in bad Black boys? And when I think about it, sometimes I could say, well, it was part of a linear trajectory, like my scholarly life developed in this way. But indeed, it was probably not as linear as all of that. I think my interest began with the fact of having bad boys in my family. An uncle who ended up in jail, nephews, and other people in the family I got to know and love, even though they were somewhat troubled. In addition, growing up in the housing project in New Orleans, where there were quite a few challenges of dealing with kids who had difficulties. But again, there were always relationships that were complex. I knew the difficulties they were experiencing, but at the same time, they were friends. They were family. They were people that I loved and respected in many ways. And then probably the most critical juncture was when I graduated from college. The first job I ever had was as a, quote, house parent in Queens, New York. That was like a community house for Children's Village, which served boys, pre-adolescent boys who were, quote, pre-delinquent or had emotional difficulties. And I was hired because they needed someone to live with the boys and be like a parent to them. The first day that I arrived at the house in the evening. The boys were already asleep. And so my first job was to wake them up to go to school, to get them to school on time. So you can imagine how difficult that could be. Well, I proceeded, with a lot of enthusiasm. I go up there, 2 or 3 to a room, and I wake up someday and they're groggy. And so I get to this one kid. He's in bed. He's a big kid, very big, and he's sound asleep. And I said, Audie, it's time to get up. You're gonna be late for school. And his first response, get the fuck off of me. And I said, oh my God, I back up. And I said, I don't know how this is gonna turn out. Well, our relationship developed over time. And when I was leaving, no, actually before I was leaving, on my birthday, I was so touched. They all got together and got me this beautiful shirt. It was a wonderful shirt. And later I thought about it. I said, wait a minute, that was an expensive shirt. They don't have money. How did they get this shirt? So I realized that somehow I had benefited from their deviant behavior, which I hadn't been able to change. The other side is when soon after this experience, I was accepted into a clinical psychology training program. And because I was a Black male, and we were rare species at the time in clinical training programs, anytime there was a Black kid, particularly male, they were sent my way. And I thought it was good. Here I am. I'm this young Black dude. I can relate to them, so send them my way. I got this. And I had a lot of success, particularly with the younger ones, because I could do my behavioral thing, set up a little, do an ABC analysis and figure out what the consequences were and alter them, and often experience a lot of success. Well, my view of myself changed dramatically with one case that I will always remember. Sometimes I try to give him different names in the talks that I give. So if you hear different names, it's because I'm slipping. But I'll call him Daniel for our purpose. So Daniel was a typical bad Black boy. He was referred by the schools because they had seen some signs of difficulty, but he had started becoming violent. He tripped a kid in class. And they felt, well, it's time that he receive help. And so he was referred to me. And I said, okay, I'm going to do my usual magic with Daniel. I talked to his mother and said, so what's going, can you tell me a little bit about what's going on? She said, that's no problem. The school is prejudiced against him. That's why they made me come here with you. I said, okay, well, let me talk with him. So imagine now, this is a small room, and not much, not much space, just the desk. And so I'm sitting behind the desk, and Daniel comes in. His arms are folded like this. His lips are pursed. I said, well, Daniel, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? What are the things you like to do? Silence. Oh, okay. What school do you go to? Can you tell me that? Silence. I tried for what felt like an interminable amount of time. Daniel would not say a word to me. And I says, okay, well, I got this. I can handle this. And so I tried to talk about pleasant things, talk about family. He would not say a word. And I said, okay, well, let me go to my supervisor, get a little help here. He says, well, why don't you try playing some games with him, use some card things where he has to respond, but non-verbally. So we tried that. No response. Daniel would come, he would sit there, but he would not respond. He would not acknowledge me. He would not in any way relate to me. And so I felt like, gee, I don't know what I'm going to do here. So I switched. I said I was a complete convert to family therapist. If I can't get him to talk to me, maybe within the context of his family, we can do some work. And so we did progress. I got to know the family, some of the issues. The mother was depressed. She was having difficulty with some of the other kids, but others were doing well, were doing okay in school. What I found out when I went to Daniel's school was that he was having some academic difficulties and hadn't been a behavior problem, except the time when he would refuse to change for gym. He would not put shorts on for gym. And one time when he was more recently, a teacher told me he'd given him a test. And everyone was doing their tests, and it was time to turn the papers in. Daniel's paper was turned in, and it was blank, nothing on it. And the teacher asked, "Say, what's the matter here, Dan?" He says, and so Daniel turns and says, "You erased my answers." He says, "Oh, this kid is learning how to manipulate the system here." So I go into the class, when I'm in the classroom, the social worker is with me, and he won't connect. He's kind of like doesn't want to associate with me, doesn't want people to know that I'm the reason that he's there. And so the social worker says, maybe we should take him down to my office. And she says, "Daniel, why don't you come with me? I have some donuts in my office." So he turns to her and said, "You can't bribe me." I says, uh-oh, this kid, he's smart. He knows the situation, and he is trying to take charge in some way. So things progressed with Daniel, not as quickly or as I had hoped. But in the end, I found out that he couldn't read. And he had had a series of traumatic experiences, from the loss of his father to an accident that scalded the right side of his leg, to losing his front teeth in an accident. And so there were just a number of things that happened to him, but fundamentally he couldn't read. And when I look back at the work with him, I feel a little bit guilty, thinking, I wish I had known what I know now about reading and some of the issues that are associated with it. And in some ways, it may have been the stimulus for my really digging into how children acquire early mathematics and how they learn early literacy. So if I knew then what I know now, I think I could have been a lot more helpful to him. But by the time it was the end of the clinical year, I had to move on. And so what I did do was to refer him to, fortunately, the university had a reading clinic. And so he was referred there, and my hope is that he progressed. I don't know. There are not too many of my cases that I think about all the time, and his is one. And I think now he's old enough now where he's probably a grandfather. And I often wonder what happened to him. Did he make it to being a grandfather? And I was once tempted to try to call him, but I said, no, he won't even remember. I'm just a blip in his life. Although he has a large space in my life, he won't even remember that he spent time with me. So I moved on. But I was challenged to understand, well, what is it? How did things become this bad? How is it that so many of our young boys have difficulty? And I realized that I felt that it was a failure. My work with him was a failure, and that he challenged my identity as an effective therapist. And so in some ways, not consciously, but unconsciously, it set me off on a course to try to understand how do these kinds of issues develop. And so I spent a lot of time in early childhood program, because I figured, well, that's where it is. I'm going to find the answer to this question by looking at kids who are very young, preschool kids, early development. And the basic answer, I found that they're pretty typical. When we looked at data from a national sample of boys, actually American children, uh, in both temperament, attachment, and early social competence, the basic story is they're not really that different than other kids. Up to about age 3 or 4, they look pretty much the same. And so I'm going to show you some data. So in these observational studies that we did, a national sample of children enrolled in public pre-K programs. We did both observations at home. We did measures of attachment, and basically found that they were pretty much the same. They complied with parental requests. They were sociable. They formed secure attachments that were rates, in the US at least, about 50% of American children form secure attachments. And about the same number of Black boys form avoidant and anxious attachments. So they're not, so that can't account. So it's as early, sorry. In terms of temperament, they had similar temperamental traits as other kids. A National Early Childhood Learning longitudinal study, the NIH National Health Interview Survey, where they do these measures. And all of these studies, Black boys are really not that, as a group, are not very different than other groups of children. And so it makes me, it was a further puzzle then. There were, we did find some minor temperamental differences. They had slightly more trouble sleeping, staying asleep compared to peers. But they were more adaptable to change. If they put in different environments, they seemed to adapt more easily than other kids. And they were sociable. They seemed to be comfortable when they were around unfamiliar adults. They made new friends. So there's nothing here that would give me any clue about why things are so difficult. They demonstrate in early childhood programs, they are described as having high levels of self-regulation, curiosity, effort for control, high in emotional management. And that actually, the interesting thing is, if you didn't know the literature and look at these studies, you would think, we know the few boys that have lots of problems, and they're the ones that make us think that all boys in early childhood programs are having trouble. But for the most part, they're not. As a group, they're not. Early on, they demonstrate concern, caring, affection for others. And you got to say, I love this picture. They're exuberant. They're joyful. They dance and they laugh. They enjoy life. And so it leaves us so, if life is so promising in the beginning, how is it that their behavioral and emotional development over time becomes problematic? Where does it become problematic? Why? So this was a puzzle to me. But how do we figure this out? How do they veer off this kind of normal, typical developmental trajectory? Because we know they veer off because they're reported later on in life as having a level of opposition, aggression, peer conflict. They're more likely to be described as having ADHD symptoms and diagnosis. They don't do well reading and math in school. They are suspended and expelled at higher rates. They're more likely to be assigned to special education and less likely than others to be assigned to gifted programs. They drop out of high school at higher rates, and they have low college attendance rates. So we know later on in life, things don't look very good. So how does this happen? How do we explain it? How do we explain the difficult peer relationships? The rate of aggression that increases over time, twice the national rate of externalizing behaviors, school disengagement and failure, juvenile offending and incarceration. We know that there are long-term concerns, that we can't dismiss this as being a trivial issue. And as adults, they're disconnected from work, family, civic life. They have poor health outcomes. So why do so many Black boys who begin life like others, they're cherubic, sweet, lovable, innocent, when, where?
Thank you for joining me for part 1 of this 3-part podcast series. The first part has raised an important question, which I have not yet answered, but which will be answered in part 2. If Black boys are just as likely to exhibit signs of optimal behavioral and emotional functioning as other children, why are they seen as more troublesome? If they are just as likely to be securely attached to parents, if they show early competencies in the social arena, why are they more likely to be seen as problems as they get older? In part 2 of this series, I will summarize the research on the problems of Black boys to demonstrate the range of difficulties that they experience. I will explain how they are viewed as troubled and troublesome, and when in their lives do these problems become so apparent that they're more often seen as disobedient, aggressive, and disruptive. Why are Black boys more likely to be punished severely? I hope you will join me for part 2.